Good afternoon. Well, now it's official. Okay. That was a good rehearsal. I'd like to invite you to respond once again. Good afternoon. Hey, okay, happy Pride, y'all. So glad to see our dance and Pride-friendly friends here today. I think I just got to meet most of you, but in case we did not, my name's Christy Bolingbroke. I'm the Executive Artistic Director for the National Center for Choreography right here in Akron, Ohio. And I am thrilled to have you join us for our Dancing Conversations series. Dancing Conversations are, simply put, locating dance in alternative fields and places of study. We believe that dance can process the world that we live in, and especially these days, what could be more political than our bodies and our governance over them? So we are extra thrilled to be able to contribute to the Pride festivities and celebrate Jessie Factor's research and development. I want to remind you that we have access to all of our speakers and performers' biographies by accessing the QR code outside the auditorium. In the event of an emergency, or if you need to take a moment in the restroom, you know where the exits are, the way that you came in. And with that said, I just want to let you know that NCCAkron is a research and development space. We are uniquely located in donated space on the University of Akron campus, and very much so it is about what does it mean to be an art maker in a research university environment. So I often like to tell our polymer science friends here in Akron that a choreographer going into the studio is the same as a scientist going into a lab. We maybe don't know what we're going to make next, but we have a couple of ideas about where we're going. And it's with that in mind today that I'm especially excited that we get a peek at Jessie's research. How many of you know who Martha Graham is, by show of hands? Okay, about a little more than half. But maybe you know of her, but maybe wouldn't be able to replicate a particular move right here on stage. And how many of you know who Madonna is? Okay, that is almost 100%. Fabulous. So I think that says a lot about forms of distribution for art and media and performance, and what better way for some of you to get your very first introduction to Martha Graham, but perhaps through the lens of Madonna. And that is what Jessie has planned for us to experience today. We will go back and forth from some live performance excerpts and then have a conversation with some of our special invited guest speakers. But to get us started, I'm going to read a quote, and this is from Harper's Bazaar in 1990, and it is Madonna speaking of Martha Graham. I felt a sort of camaraderie with her pioneering spirit and rebellious creative energy. What really stayed with me was my first impression. She was part Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard. The rest of her was a cross between a kabuki dancer and the nun I was obsessed with in the 5th grade, Sister Kathleen Thomas. Her hair was pulled back very severely, displaying a pace face made up like a porcelain doll. She was small and big at the same time. This was my first true encounter with a goddess. With that said, please join me with a warm round of applause welcoming Jessie Factor.
Critics have called Martha Graham the undisputed star of our modern dance world. Surprisingly enough, this pioneer in the dance did not begin her training until she was 16. Born in Pittsburgh, the daughter of a physician, she grew up in California. She made her New York debut in 1926, then won a Guggenheim Fellowship, the first ever given to a dancer. She made and continues to make dance history. Agnes DeMille wrote, "Dancers for untold generations will dance differently because of her labors." Here now is Martha Graham.
Imagination to me is only one thing. It is the power to make images. And if you are an image maker, you have that quality which is called imagination. That's just not flight. That is the power to make an image. When I started, there was nothing to dance with in Santa Barbara at that time, so I didn't take dancing there. People in Germany were doing things. Isadora Duncan, I never saw Isadora Duncan. I saw her 6 girls, but I did go to Ruth St. Denis. But I knew I had inveigled my father into taking me once to Los Angeles to see her. He was against this a little bit, but he couldn't refuse me much. He was a doctor. And he knew I was a stormy soul. So he took me, and of course, then that was it. I knew. Ruth St. Denis I studied with. I had 10 years of actual physical dancing, training and dancing on the stage before I ever did any new technique or any new composition. I was a craftsman, and I was only interested then in being a craftsman and a dancer as a performer. I never heard the word choreography, but I learned. One of my early dances, sculptural thing. I was a little early, but I did. I know that I've never forgotten, and I always realized from that moment on the intrinsic responsibility of a performer. There's always one to whom you speak. There's always one. There's always one.
I take this puppet, which is myself, and I fling him against the sky. It's a glorification, in very frank terms, of a very simple fact. The appetite for life, every child has it. You do adore movement. You do adore your body. You do adore the space in which it moves. I take this puppet, which is myself, and I fling him against the sky. I was intoxicated with movement, just myself moving. It is fundamentally without story. And I feel that that girl, and I felt it when I danced, that dance took the puppet, which was myself, and I flung it against the sky. Because light is such a magical, magical thing. You see, a bird never flies into the dark, who is built for the light. I take this puppet, which is myself, and I fling him against the sky. Take this puppet. 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 Because light is such a magical, magical thing. See, a bird never flies into the dark, who is built for the light. I take this puppet, which is myself, and I fling him against the sky.
Jesse's going to set up while we have our conversation. And I was already so enthralled. I was like, oh my God, that's right. We're supposed to be having a conversation. On this side. So I'm pleased to welcome Catherine Meredith to join me on stage. And Catherine is a choreographer and an educator here in Northeast Ohio, as well as a former Graham dancer. And so we're very interested to hear more, and you can follow more on Catherine's biography by checking the QR code just outside the entrance to the auditorium. But Catherine, how would you like to share with our new friends your relationship? How would you describe your relationship to Graham's work?
It started fairly young, fortunately, although it wasn't exact. I had teachers at the New England Dance Conservatory back in East Long Meadow, Massachusetts, that had diverse backgrounds and had backgrounds in the Graham technique. So at a very young age, I started learning contraction, release, and spiral, which are the fundamentals of this beautiful, which you saw very clearly on Jesse Factor's body. And then I got to college at SUNY Purchase. I encountered Kazuko Hirabayashi, and I was at the Earle School, and I got to work with Steve Rooks, and then I was invited into, it was then called Cleveland Repertory Project, became Verb Ballets, and now is Ohio Contemporary Ballet.
Yes, we got the Providence.
And so I was invited to come in, and I didn't even know what role I would get, but I said, I will stand on stage and hold the revivalist hat. I don't care what I have to do, I want to be in it. And so I was able to be part of Appalachian Spring, the cast of Appalachian Spring. So.
And Appalachian Spring is a quintessential Graham piece, if you're taking notes to Google later, to Aaron Copland's score of the same name. And so follow-up question, I mean, it sounds like you really came of age and did your dance training when all these amazing luminaries were still with us to do this teaching, to literally, pass on the tradition body to body. How have you found in coming to your own age as a choreographer, is the Graham technique still a part of how you think about movement, or are you consciously trying to exorcise it all the time and make space for your own voice? Where are you inside of that conversation?
I think as a choreographer, you wear the trace of your lineage of what you came up doing, and so Graham can never leave me. It finds its way into my work, even if I'm not doing it on purpose. So, and the contraction is kind of where all life starts, in that pelvis. And it's very grounded, so I think it ties in with a lot of what I do.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about it. For anyone who doesn't have dance training, if you've ever been in any kind of fitness or class and they tell you to use your core, that's a small taste of the power of the female pelvis in Graham technique. But I would also want to offer, since getting to see some of your work, I think some of the drama, the intention and intensity of the movement also seems very similar to how you direct performers to execute your vision.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would. I also want to add that I teach the Graham technique at Kent State University, and so it's always prevalent in my life, and I do teach the drama because it's a part of the technique. So yes, it definitely, I think, in my work, thinking about identity, which she worked a lot in, just traveling by train across country, which she did when she was a girl, traveling from Pennsylvania to out west, and looking out the window of the train and looking at people having their lives and the landscape, and that all fed into her work as well. So, yeah.
Even, hearing what we notice about people in the communities with that sense of travel. There was a conversation that Jessie participated in at Elizabeth's Bookshop on Thursday night, and one of the things talking about queer identity and art making in the Midwest was recognizing the space and being able to see each other in community. And so much of the reflections that he and the fellow artist Luster shared were so action driven, which of course spoke to me and maybe you in the dance world. We're like, yes, action, verbs. And so it feels like drama is not just this thing that you put on, like you're doing a telenovela in dance, but it is how you fully show up in your body in spaces, whether they be on stage or in a boardroom.
Exactly. Yeah. Perfectly said.
What did you notice with your sort of personal experience in your own body to then watch Jessie's research? What might you share some observations?
I love the homage to lamentation, obviously, with the stretched fabric, the tube.
Another quintessential Graham piece, Lamentation.
If you're not familiar with the work, it's a very early work of hers, and it's symbolic of grief. So it's an emotion, because Martha Graham famously said the body doesn't lie. So the physicality that one takes on when you're thinking about perhaps grief or that mourning process, what do? Just instinctually, we kind of collapse in ourselves. And we saw that on the bench, which is a little bit of an homage to Lamentation. In that contraction, when Jessie is lying flat across.
You can demonstrate if you want. I mean, dancers can't talk without their bodies,
I don't
basically.
know if there's enough space here, but yeah.
Applause.
But that while simultaneously hearing Lucky Star by Madonna, and the juxtaposition of this kind of sharp, more contemporary movement, that locking out, into this technique that is from 100 years ago. Yeah. It's just a beautiful marriage. And then hearing that music, that popular music, I guess, frames it in a very present day way. So,
I love the reminder of the decisions that Jessie made. And that's something oftentimes when I'm watching work, I'm like, okay, what decisions is the artist making? Nothing is by accident.
And I think, sometimes your first introduction, I remember when I first saw the Graham Company, and I was like, what? It was challenging for me, to be honest.
Thank you.
And I went, I don't know that I ever would want to do that. Although, naivete. And I think that when you can reframe it, there's all of a sudden it becomes a little bit more accessible. So seeing the story of just say, like, let's say Appalachian Spring on the frontier, and it may be difficult in present day to relate. But I think
it feels so much
it feels antiquated.
Yes.
And then you are able to kind of have a window in, and you go, oh, hey, I recognize that. Because I think sometimes art has this ability to make people feel like insecure about what they know or don't know, right? And we never want to put the wall up. We want to invite people in.
Yes.
And finding wonderful ways to do that, which Jessie has done here, is terrific. So,
last question: what, if any, relationship would you describe to Madonna?
Being a child, I won't say exactly when I was born, but of the 80s and 90s, I don't think you can escape childhood without having danced till you dropped in your bedroom to Lucky Star, physical attraction, borderline.
Papa Don't Preach.
Papa Don't Preach, La Isla Bonita. We could go on and on, right? But she is an icon.
Yeah.
She is pop culture. I don't think you could say her name in any country or any part of the world, the universe, where people don't know who she is. And think about how many people we can say that about.
Yeah.
So when I moved to New York, because she was a student close by at University of Michigan, and she was a dance major, and she left school to move to New York to just get going on it, and a little kinship there because I was a dance student at SUNY Purchase, and I was like, I want to get this going too. I left school, went to New York, and I had seen her in concert. I would go to the same club she started at, Danceteria. When she would be in a restaurant and I'd get someone would call, she's like, she's at the restaurant, we'd race down there to try to see her, just to catch a glimpse, So very much a part of growing up. We dressed like her, we tried to dance like her. Yeah.
Yeah, similar kinship. Yeah, absolutely. And this was before Instagram, before social media. So really to understand how a public figure could break through for that kind of staying power to be seen as well.
And her relationship to Graham, having been a student of hers, I think shows up in she really brought dance to her music, really, the videos, and had a lovely marriage with that and continues to.
And the stage productions as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Catherine, thank you for sharing a glimpse into your perspective with today's performance excerpts. Please give a round of applause to Catherine.
Thank you.
And Jesse will share another performance excerpt, and then I'll be back with another guest speaker.
The first time I came to Chicago, I was passing through on my way to New York. And you always had to wait several hours on the train. And I went to the Institute with Louis Horst. And I saw my first modern painting. Well, I walked into that room, and I knew that the dream that I had in my mind, I didn't know what it was going to be. But I felt that I was not crazy, that I had family and friends that I would never meet. You knew that a cast iron image, while it had not been destroyed, some catalytic agent had entered, and it was a new way of communication. Almost fainted dead away on the floor.
That's about all the choreography we can handle. So we're back, and I'm pleased to welcome Wendy Earle to join me here on the stage. Wendy is a curator at the Akron Art Museum, just down the street from us here. Wendy, not a dance curator, would love to hear, what did you notice from what Jessie has shared with us so far?
A lot of things. Obviously, as a visual arts person, I'm paying a lot of attention to the color and how effective that was, the changes. I also, as someone who focuses a lot on contemporary work but has a really strong background in ancient, I always sort of go back to materiality, and so I'm thinking about the purple. Purple used to be made from shells. It's called Tyrian purple, and literal snail shells, and it was so expensive, only used for royalty, because you had to kill thousands of these snails to get a yard of fabric. And so just thinking about that and kind of the history of that, but then how he uses it so beautifully, and this depth of fabric and the choices that he makes. And then I'm also thinking about how it's so interesting because it's a completely different relationship to audience than I have. I'm used to, you have a sculpture, you get to put it out, and you think a lot about how the audience gets to interact with it, but then the audience gets to make that choice, right? They get to see what angles they get to choose, how they're going to interact with it, and how much time they're going to spend with it. But then when you have dance, the artist is making all those choices, right? We're sitting here, we make the choice to come here, but then we can't choose what angles, we can't choose how long we're going to look at a particular pose. And so just these ideas of decisions get completely reversed within different art forms. And I love that because there's so much room for creativity then, and also being an audience member, it's kind of nice to not have to make those decisions sometimes. You get museum fatigue for sure, from having to walk around and just constantly engage with things and make these decisions. But it's nice to have that opposite role too.
And once again, the activeness of that decision making, whether it's to repeat a move, and coming at you in a time-based medium. That we've talked about that you can choose if you want to spend all day in front of a piece of art at the museum. You cannot with a performance. No. The dancer will not perform for you all day. No. You brought up sculpture, and Martha Graham also had a history of working with Noguchi as a sculptor. So I'm really curious, in your experience, are there ways that it's visible how artists are influencing each other?
I would hope so. I assume so for the audience. You guys maybe not familiar with Isamu Noguchi, but you can probably get a sense of a little bit of that East and West influence there in both Martha's work and then what Jessie's bringing to it as well. With the makeup choices.
The starkness.
But there's so much more that goes into it, and then I think for visual artists, it's always exciting to work with dancers and performing artists because again, their normal practice is to just make something and it's out in the world, and they don't get to choose how people interact with it. They can't even choose where it goes a lot of times. It's, you make a sculpture, maybe it gets bought, maybe it gets resold again and again, maybe a museum buys it, but then you don't get to choose how they display it, when they display it, if it just goes into storage forever. And so I think that that's something that visual artists really love to see reversed, and to see that decision making that dancers can bring to it, I think is really exciting. But then also the reverse of that is, who's going to see it? Are they just going to see it once in this performance, and then all this work doesn't necessarily come out again? So it is maybe a double-edged sword for a lot of different collaborations and figuring out what are the pros and cons of that.
Right. It all comes back to a different time proposition. Even if you had a more, straight up lights and tights version of dance, a lot of times dance gets performed for one weekend, three or four shows, and it may never get performed again. So you best be lucky if you catch it. Absolutely. It's a choice and an intentionality to be there for that. But I love the idea of not just influencing a visual artist in the making of a work as a collaborator, but also by being able to introduce a new context for them to see their own work too. I remember working with a group of visual arts students in the Bay Area, and the way they came in and talked about the dance work that was being shared, they were really interested in like, oh, how is it being supported? Because you can't tour all the way around it. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting, because when we talk about support in dance, we're talking about body weight. How am I gonna support myself with that core, and at the same time give you some sense of my body weight to convey something to the audience?
Yeah.
I'm curious, we were talking a little bit as curators, we have the privilege and honor to witness so many artists in their work, and it is sort of like a spectator sport, if you will, to be able to say, I get to go to artist studios and clock this over time, not just what gets shared in the museums, but otherwise. And maybe some of us then hear about a movement. Oh, that's a modernist movement. This is now a Fluxus movement or happening. And there is no big decision. No one puts out the call on social media. All right, from here on out, we're declaring the Madonna movement.
Yeah. They can try.
Yes.
But they're not going to be very successful.
So how do certain aesthetic or artistic movements seem to coalesce? And are there any defining factors before you're like, wait, we're in the middle of one?
I don't think so. I don't think there are any defining factors. There's always so much going on, and it really is something that art historians get to decide after the fact. Oh, here's the thing that I noticed was happening 10 years ago that everyone seemed to be doing. And I think when you're in the middle of it, it's impossible to see it because you're creative. You are getting influences from everywhere. You are having conversations with all of these different people. And it's up to the scholars, people who are not as creative, to be able to figure that out, what was actually happening. And they don't always get it right either. That's like, well, we kind of missed this major female artist, Hilma af Klimt. We didn't figure out what was happening with her until 50 years after her death, where she was preceding all of these major abstract modernists by 10, 15 years. Like, she was doing it by herself before anyone else was doing it. So yeah, I don't think you can know that you're in a movement until it's already passed, unfortunately.
Right, we're not like Taylor Swift to be able to declare our eras.
Yes.
But it's a helpful reminder, I think, also to the importance of research of the work that Jesse's doing, not only from what's been experienced inside of his body, but then also the perspective to have enough distance to reflect back. In that time too, and to keep
this archiving that he's doing physically on stage, which is so interesting as a scholar to think about how he's repurposing this and bringing it all to us. This research, he's presenting it, and I think in a very interesting way. I'm never going to be able to do that sort of research presentation, but that's truly what this is.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wendy. We have one more performance excerpt from Jesse, and then we'll get to talk to the person themselves.
The essential of dance is not in words, but is in movement. Now that movement is embodied in each one of us. Larry said a wonderful thing about dance at one time to me. He said, Martha, everybody's born with genius, but most people only keep it a few minutes. And I think that is true. If you don't keep that intrinsic curiosity, if you don't keep that attention to the slightest wind that blows, you have no place in the dance. It takes about 10 years to make a dancer. The body should be pliable to start with, and it should be eager, and it should realize what technique is, what St. Augustine calls the regality of order, which is every time the hand comes up or the foot comes up to a certain level, it should come up exactly that same way the next time, 50 times out of 50. In order to do that, it takes endless training, it takes sorrow, it takes joy, and it takes infinite weariness. But those are part of the craft and part of the joy of it. But to watch them, to feel the light, to know that it is an ever-present thing, makes me think when I was a child. I was born in Pittsburgh. We went to California, and suddenly light burst upon my consciousness. Pittsburgh was a very dark city at that time, and I ran along the mesa of the cliffs, falling down and standing up with my head up in the air, impassioned by this light, intoxicated with the light, so overcome with the wonder of light. I've never overcome that wonder at the word light. And I think perhaps one of the most terrifying and beautiful prayers in the Bible is, let there be light. So we say to you, let there be light.
You'd like to. We love transformation. Maybe another round of applause for Jessie Factor. You have some fans.
Thank you all for coming.
And I wanted to introduce our Q&A, our brief discussion, with a quote that you've provided of Martha speaking of Madonna. I liked her tremendously. You're not going to lip sync, are you? Okay.
Not this time.
I was like, we didn't rehearse that. All right. I liked her tremendously. She is forthright. She is going to get what she wants, and to hell with you. She is a maverick. Yes, she is criticized. She is naughty and dares you to react. But she only puts on stage what most women hide. And yes, it may not be respectable. In 1980, a well-meaning fundraiser came to see me and said, Miss Graham, the most powerful thing you have going for you to raise money is your respectability. I wanted to spit. Respectable? Show me any artist who wants to be respectable.
How apropos.
How apropos. The artist Jessie Factor. I'm so interested to then add another layer. We've been sort of talking and toggling about Madonna and Martha Graham today, but in our preparation, you also talked about the art of the lip sync. Can you speak a little bit more about how that layer has informed your research?
Yeah, I see the lip sync as a really nuanced form of choreography, in fact. The choreography of the face, using the mouth, the muscles surrounding the mouth, visual focus, the angle of the head. It's so nuanced. And in lip sync, in my work, I've used it previously before. I see it as a way of sort of channeling. And I think it's a sacred act. It's very sort of the way time stops and the body becomes a vessel to channel this voice that was recorded in the past and bring it into the future. And it takes a lot of work, particularly, I've done other lip syncs for other figures. Martha, when she's speaking, the cadence is very tricky in terms of the rhythmic play. So that's taken a long time to find where the pauses are and where the flow is. But yeah, I've been really fascinated by the lip sync as a form of choreography in those sort of ideas that I mentioned.
Did your familiarity with Graham technique, which does have very specific exercises and ritual of practice, and that sense of timing, did it inform or help you get into her cadence at all?
That's such a good question. I would say yes. I think the way sort of sometimes like the whole spine moves is fun to use sometimes. For instance, in the opening monologue, when Martha Graham talks about her father not being able to refuse her going to Los Angeles to see Ruth St. Denis because she was a stormy soul.
Yes.
The way the whole spine is sort of moving side to side. And then in the end, you know, there's that phrase, there's always one. Using that contraction to punctuate that, I found that you know, those sort of amplify elements.
It gives you somewhere to start.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's not just on the surface.
Yeah, and then like sort of maybe that's a starting place, and then it sort of opens up from there, from the words and the center of the body and the face.
Can we talk about the third performance excerpt, which, if memory serves, there was a lot of hairography.
Yeah.
And I can always be counted on to appreciate that.
Yeah.
And how much of that is Jesse added interpretation?
None.
And none of it. This
Yeah.
is what's part of in like
It's all archival, pulling archival pieces and repurposing them. So I guess there was a period, probably in the 30s, there's a dance called Celebration that was done with when the company was all women and their hair is flying in the wind and they're jumping up and jumping down. And then this piece is pulled from loosely from excerpts, a piece called Satiric Festival Song, where there was a lot of hair flying. And I think in a larger part, that was part of a bigger movement, literally to for an unbound body. And so, you know, traditionally at that time, maybe available to dancers were, you know, classical ballet, which is pretty pulled back and you don't see a lot of hair, or for instance, like a showgirl or a course girl, where you might have some kind of fascinator or a hat on, but the hair flying free was a choice as well. So yeah, I really enjoy that. I have to make sure that the wig is pinned really well and glued. We don't need it to, that would be a different dance.
But I also love the reminder, right? Like, Beyonce did not introduce us to hairography. This has been happening.
It's been around.
Yes, and it's a constant sort of iteration on a form and approach. And Martha and Madonna are both benchmarks through performing female bodies in space. I'm curious to talk a little bit more about your production choices. When you're maybe lifting it up from an archive, the Purple Lamentation, and now finding out how expensive it was to make the color purple back in the day, to also, you have a different dress.
Yes, so if you could all just imagine that this is stripes, sequined. This is a rehearsal dress. So you just have to come to the performance. You have to come to the premiere in November to see the full.
In Pittsburgh, at the Kelly Strayhorn.
To see the full striped sparkle, which is also sort of a blinged out version of the original. Yeah.
How much are you making some production design decisions in dialogue with the originals versus finding your own more modern or personal point of view?
I usually start with the archive right away, and then that sort of leads me into my own ways of, like, for instance, with this big skirt, I found so many new things to do that aren't in the original dance. It's pulled from an earlier dance that was made in 34, part of a larger work called Chronicle, and this skirt appeared, and I was like, I've always wanted, you know, that's the whole work is like things that I was never able to do when I was in the company, and I'm sort of realizing a fantasy now of doing that, repurposing it in different ways. But I usually start with as clear a version, learning small excerpts, small figures, small phrases, and then building out from there. For me, that works best. Yeah.
Similar to the question I asked Catherine earlier, then as a choreographer in your own right, is that a real inner tussle every time you go into the studio that you're like, I want to do my work? And when do you lean and sort of celebrate the Graham technique and Martha's work, and when do you find your own movement choices?
I think in a way, the composition is the arranging of it. So the vocabulary, a lot of the vocabulary could be from class anyway, so it would be with any kind of steps, taking it and repurposing it. So I see the real choreographic act as the compositional act of finding where things go. And a lot of times, I think of it as a diving board to sort of spring into a new place with it. So I do feel like it's, that I think, if you hear a really good remix, that's an art of itself. So I'm thinking about that and how remixing, repurposing, reinventing, re-energizing, re-envisioning, all of those things. That's sort of the choreographic act, and I'm sort of wading through the past, picking up things, putting them on top of this, seeing how it works, what it activates in new ways for me. And I think in particular, the second, take this puppet, that sort of is the direction that I feel the work is going into, where it's really a layering of the two against each other, and then it reveals like this weird new thing, which is really fun to play with.
The remixing as a tool is in itself perhaps closer to a 21st century tool because of digital technologies and just having access to that in ways that were not available even in the 70s and 80s. So I appreciate understanding at what point that this is also not an archival approach, but it is that reimagining and making it relatable, to add another re into the mix. Jesse, thank you so much for sharing. I want to extend an extra thank you to our funders who also make this possible, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Ohio Arts Council, the Akron Community Foundation, the GAR Foundation, also to NCCAkron team members, Nikisha, Christy, Laura, Sarah. Huge thanks and appreciation to all of you for celebrating part of your pride with us today. Please join me in a final thank you to Jesse Factor.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming.